will be available to everyone. And I hope you guys enjoy the stream and check out my YouTube channel to where you can, get all not only these tips but other tips, and hopefully some of them prove useful to you. Last time I streamed, we covered gods, goddesses, deities, and pantheons, essentially going over the whole religious archetypes and all that when it comes to most D&D worlds. And I wanted to continue on with that and going into essentially following with the Dungeon Master's Guide, because it gives a pretty comprehensive way of building your world. And so next we're going to go with, the actual mapping of your kingdom. Now, I unfortunately am not able to draw a map for you, because the way I did it when I was making Thirdskin campaign, I went through notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of maps before I finally settled on using a random generator and then photoshopping it to the way I wanted it. And even when I look at it now, it's just not 100% what I want, but excuse me, it's essentially close enough to what I want to where I can use it and be somewhat happy. But as far as assisting with how to plan out your, kingdoms and city-states and the provinces and the continents, I can help with that to an extent. So, for the most part, when it comes to the size of a continent or province, you need to determine how much land does this governmental entity have. Because the more powerful they have, the more land they have. That's normally how it goes. The more land they have, the more powerful they are, because they've got more soldiers to guard and patrol that land and to essentially fight off anyone who tries to steal it from them. So, the larger a kingdom is, the larger a province is, or, a city-state, the more powerful they are. So that's something to keep in mind when you're planning out your kingdoms and so on. Also remember, continents tend to be very large, landlocked pieces. Like if you look at the map of North America, it's multiple kingdoms if you broke them down into like different states and so on for, the United States. Each state could be its own kingdom, and in some cases, some of them are massive in the sense of, like, Texas. So, when it comes to determining what your continent should be, just remember that, for the most part, all continents are massive and all linked together somehow. And a continent tends to have more than one ruling entity. It also tends to have more than one type of person or type of race or so on the landmass. Just making sure my things are working right. There we go. Alright, so like I said, as far as continent goes, they tend to have multiple races, multiple languages, and so on this one giant landmass. And it has to be big. It would have to cover a large enough portion of the world map to be considered a continent. Otherwise, it's going to be closer to an island. Australia, while it is big, I guess it would be kind of a continent, wouldn't it? But it's very big versus, say, Japan, which is a nation of linked together islands. So moving forward, let's talk about settlements. The places people live, where they have their towns or hamlets and so on. There are some very quick, easy questions to ask yourself when you are planning out these cities or settlements, which is, what purpose do they serve in the game? Because really, when you're mapping out this world, you should focus on what your players are going to interact first. Not the whole world. Don't plan on, mapping out the entire world first. I made that mistake, and it took me years to actually get to a point to where I feel like I've overdone it, in a sense, because I could probably tell you every little nook and cranny of the Surskin world from, like, memory, and that is too overdone. I went ham on it, and I overdid it. I overmade what was necessary for the campaign. And while definitely that helps me out later on when I decide to run other campaigns and, other groups through the world, that doesn't help me with the current campaign that I am running because, oh, excuse me, adjusting on my chair. Because they aren't going to see the whole world. They're going to hear about parts of it, but they'll never see it. So having all that drawn up and ready is not really important. Having small notes about the rest of the world, yeah, that's definitely important. But as far as having everything detailed out, that's not so much. So only focus on the campaign path first when you're planning out your world. So say, the city or settlement they start in, what purpose does it serve to the game? How big is it? Who lives there? And, these are kind of important because if it's, say, just a small town, then they probably only have a mayor and maybe one or two nobles, but that's about it. And it's probably not very big, but at the same time, it might have more of like wooden walls and maybe a gatehouse or two. But for the most part, not overly demanding of attention. If I could put it in the words of, like, say, Skyrim, it would be Rorikstead would be a small town where Windhelm would be, I would say, closer to a city. Because, of course, Windhelm has stone walls. Another thing you need to consider is what are the town's defenses, which we just went over, as far as, like, walls. Does it have walls? And if so, are they wood? Are they stone? Are they magical? Because if there are magical walls, then this is definitely going to be a larger city. Oof. Adjusting my chair again. I came from the gym today, so I'm kind of worn out. Where do the characters go to find the goods and services they need? Is this sort of a pit stop kind of town where, they have a lot of commerce coming through, people coming in to buy rations and food stock for the horses? Or is this more of a larger town to where they actually have rooms and stuff for people to stop in at? You need to have, like, names of taverns, inns, general stores, all that ready, and in some cases even brothels. Have those names ready. And what I like to do is essentially make a little jar that I keep on hand, and it's just, a jar of different names of businesses. So whenever I need to, come up with a name on the fly, I'll reach into the jar, whip out a name, and it's like, oh, well, you find the brothel called the Pixie's Kitten or something like that. Or maybe, you find an old tavern by the name of Dengar's Dengar's Drunkard Dwarves or something like that. That's something you need to, keep in mind, is to have these names ready for whenever your players decide to go looking for something. You could do like I do and just have a jar of just different names that you can just reach in and pop out, or maybe go through and, like, write down in a notebook a bunch of names and just make sure that you don't use the same name twice for two different locations. So normally after I used a name, I write it down. It's like, okay, in this town, the tavern's called this, so that way I don't accidentally use it again in another town. Which I have before, and I'm like, oh yeah, this guy's the brother of the guy who had the first one. And they had a fighting, so he decided to come out this way and open up a second branch. What are the temples and other organizations that are very prominent in this town that you're mapping out for your campaign? Is the town's temple large, or does it have a temple at all? Is it so small that it doesn't have a temple? And if they don't have temples, what do they have for healing services? And as far as, like, other organizations go, say, the logging corporation, maybe they have a very tight squeeze on the city, and they have a lot of command when it comes to how things are done because they are the primary income source for this town. Or perhaps they are protected by this one estranged group of worshippers who are there in town, but they really don't care for the villagers. They just don't want it destroyed because it's right beside or on top of a ancient burial grounds that they are sworn to protect. And as always, you want to make sure you describe these towns. Like, how do they look? How do they smell? And what does it sound like? Does it sound like a bustling city with the smell of manure? Or does it, sound like there's just a cold, dreary wind constantly blowing through and no one really seems to have any life in them? Does it smell like someone just farted in your nose? These are things you have to consider when, writing up a town, because you want it to make it different from all the other towns, essentially. What you want to have it some sort of fantastic element that distinguishes it from another town. So that way it's not like, oh, well, it's just another town. No, it's like it's something better than that. It's something greater than that. It's got more to it that the other towns didn't have. And of course, always, why should the characters care about this settlement? Why should they care about this settlement to begin with? Is it just because they started there? Or is there something more going on to this town that intrigues the players? And of course, this always works into the plot hook that you have for the campaign. So maybe this is like a base of operations. They always return to this town to unwind after a long adventure. And pretty much you don't want to write a town that doesn't have a purpose. Every town that your players interact with should have a purpose for one reason or another. Sorry, needed some water. But yeah, every town needs a purpose when it comes to a campaign, because that way the players feel like something is always going on. Even if they're not there, something is going on in this town or in a town, so that way they can interact with it and feel like the world itself is alive. So as always, you might want to add some like local color to where characters might stop and rest to buy supplies. Maybe, one of the general stores is actually run by a retired adventurer who's got a number of scars and stories of his own. Or maybe, this town is known for its ale in the area, that it's very potent and has a very certain spice to the taste. These are, something to give the town color, as well as, a seams of importance. And, as I said, a home base for the players is always important when it comes to a lot of different types of campaigns. It depends on the campaign you're building, but a home base is always good because, it makes the players feel like they can come back to this town, sell their stuff, or even build something there when the time is right. And of course, the town itself could be very important to the campaign in the sense that, maybe it's the site of an adventure. Maybe it's a very plot important adventure, or maybe it's just a adventure that they have been thinking about. No, that's not a good way, but like a small side quest adventure. Something for them to do to take their minds away from the main adventure and add a bit of variety to the common pace that they would normally take. So, how do you determine the sizes of the village or of the town that you are creating? Well, according to the Dungeon Master's Guide, a village tends to have a population of about 1,000. Anything above that, you're slowly getting closer to an actual township. A village might be somewhat like a hamlet. It's got a lot of things. Normally it's just run by one person who's a noble who may or may not be there. He might have an appointed agent there to kind of take care of things, but for the most part, no real central government aside from that. The agent might have like a small source of militia soldiers who help him take care of everything, but the most part, it's like I said, not a very well defended, it's not a very big area. It's easily takeoverable by a band of orcs if you're not careful. They most likely would also have, basic supplies. They wouldn't have anything extravagant or magical by any means, but definitely good, sturdy, basic equipment that they probably get from other merchants or that they make themselves. And they might contain one temple or a shrine versus a temple, but no real other organizations. As most villages tend to be like agricultural in the sense of growing crops or harvesting from the forest, things like that. So a village is not ideal for a base starting place, other than the fact that it's self-sufficient when it comes to getting supplies, but its defenses are utter crap. Now, a town, according to the Dungeon Master's Guide, has up to 6,000 population. And this tends to be where, a noble actually lives there versus living in a village. They would actually live in a town, and they appoint a Lord Mayor to oversee administration. There might be an elected council of representatives with interests of, other towns members, but chances are that really depends on the type of kingdom that you've placed this town into. Now, this size of a town would definitely have multiple temples or shrines, maybe even a merchant's guild or other major organizations like a carpenter's guild or a logging firm. Moving on to the cities, 25,000 or up, and this is where the main head of your kingdom is most likely going to be. This is where they're going to be there to essentially give out everything. This is where the nobles will definitely live. This is where the king or the head of the kingdom lives, be it the council, be it an actual king, be it some sort of dictator or whatever. This, while the town definitely has a sizable army of professional soldiers, possibly even an additional militia, the city has the main army, or at least has a chunk of the main army if it's not the capital city. Once again, it depends on how big of a kingdom you've made. Is it run by a city-state, where it's like got one major city, but the rest are towns or villages? Or is this like multiple cities, and this is a very large kingdom, and it has a capital city somewhere? While the village and the town most likely has, basic supplies and maybe one or two exotic goods or harder to find things, the city will definitely have those magical items that the players will seek after, such as, healing potions, maybe a wand or a +1 ring, or so on and so forth. And here's a very key important thing when it comes to mapping out your campaign and mapping out the cities and such that your players will be going through. It's the atmosphere. The atmosphere of your cities, be villages, towns, hamlets, cities, whatever. The atmosphere of each one reflects the atmosphere of the campaign. If you're doing a very horror campaign, then you need these cities to be mostly, dark and dreary. Maybe a very dark cloud or omen has seemed to brush over the landscape, and everyone's just in these very down and dour moods. Or maybe it's much more upbeat and some sort of weird counter or contrast to the rest of the campaign, which will definitely put the players on edge, by the way. And of course, as always, there are governments, and not every place is like where you live in the world. There are many governments, and you need to determine which one does this city-state or kingdom have. There's autocracy, bureaucracy, confederacy, democracy, dictatorship, feudalism, and so on, all the way up to theocracy, which is essentially being ruled by religion, which has happened in the past and always, is a possible thing in the future. So determining the government also determines its relationships with neighboring kingdoms, as well as its relationships with its citizens, such as, a oligarchy has a small number of absolute rulers that share power, possibly dividing the land into districts or provinces under their control, and essentially they kind of control everything as kind of like a Congress would, but they don't really have an elected figurehead. And they are normally the most richest, most powerful individual in the land. So if someone were to say to kill them and steal their money, well, they are now the richest, most powerful person in the land. And another thing to consider is commerce. How much trade does this kingdom get with the neighboring kingdoms, as well as with itself? You know, getting food from the villages to the towns to the cities and so on. These villages heavily rely on trade with other settlements, especially including larger towns and cities. So you need to make sure that, you know, there are roads and determine how well these roads are traveled, because the well-traveled roads will most likely have more guards on them versus the less traveled roads, which might have more bandits on them, because people don't really go that way. And they're not going to go after the well-traveled roads because that's where the guards are. And of course, as always, currency. If you want to be the kind of person who says, okay, you know what? Each kingdom has its own different currency. They all have gold pieces, silver pieces, copper pieces, and electrum if you feel like torturing people. But if it's not stamped the right way, like if it doesn't have the right minting on it, well, it's not accepted, or it's accepted at a reduced cost or a reduced amount, because it's not from this kingdom. Therefore, it must, you know, it must have the king's visage on this coin in order for it to be accepted in this kingdom at full value. It doesn't matter if it's a platinum piece. It doesn't have the king's visage on it. Therefore, it's not a full platinum piece. And like I said, that's if you want to, you know, torture someone or torture your players, or just make things interesting depending on your players and yourself. But, you know, I would not do that. That's just me. Another thing is to creating your own currency is technically acceptable and allowed. It's a little difficult when it comes to it because you're having to determine the value of the currency compared to the other currencies. You know, you have 10 copper becomes 1 silver, 10 silver becomes 1 gold, 10 gold becomes 1 platinum. But then you got that weird piece in there, that's the electrum piece, which I don't know why you would ever use that, because it's terrible and it's awful, and that's all we're going to say about it. But you can create your own and say it's a single piece that is worth X amount of another piece. And that's pretty much what it comes down to. Also, once again, going back to the, you know, a continent would have a large amount of variations when it comes to races and dialogue, or, you know, languages. This is also something you're going to have to determine about when it comes to your kingdom that you're planning out for your campaign. You see, when a kingdom is large enough and they, you know, settle across a large enough amount of land, you need to determine if this kingdom spans enough land to where there are other dialects and languages in it. Do they allow foreigners into their kingdom? And if so, what foreigners are allowed? What languages do they bring? What dialects do they bring? Imagine it sort of like you're a small town on the border between Spain and France. You know, there's going to be a mix between the two languages there, as well as, you know, people who speak both languages. And this is something you're going to have to, you know, incorporate the closer you get to a neighboring kingdom, but not so much once you, or like if you're in the heart of a kingdom. And as always, factions and organizations, you know, are there other adventuring guilds? Are there, you know, a main pantheon or certain clergy, or temple clergy that, you know, they have all banded together, you know, merchant guilds, logging guilds, and so on. Factions are very important when it comes to your cities and states, because even if they are not, say, the Merchants Guild, say they are more of a Thieves Guild, regardless of what kind of faction they are, they have an impact on commerce, as well as, you know, the way things are ran in the kingdom. Say, perhaps you have, a good example is the Order of Hell Knights from the Pathfinder books, the Order of the Nail. They are technically from a neighboring kingdom and they're in Magnamar, but they're allowed there because they keep the law and so on. Never mind the fact that they do not take shit from anyone, and they are not very nice people. The fact is, they are so devoted to their tasks that they don't care. But, crime is definitely treated differently versus anywhere else that the Hell Knights aren't. Because in Magnamar, if you're caught by the normal guard, well, it's the normal guard. You'll be treated, depending on whatever you did. But if you're caught by a Hell Knight in Magnamar, oh boy, you are in for some trouble. Of course, you could add into the, the whole renown thing if you wanted, where essentially it's, how well is your characters known throughout the land based upon their actions. Are they infamous? Are they famous? And so on. And the last thing I'm going to be covering today is magic. Magic influences your campaign world to a great degree. Even if there's just a small amount of magic, it still influences a lot of things because it sends ripples throughout everything. It sends it to the far edges of the world. One spell that suddenly appears in the marketplace that, in a town that no one has ever seen magic, they're suddenly going to start talking about that. And if it appears in a city where magic has not been performed in decades, that's going to get some rumors moving very quickly. So magic in your world is a wondrous and sometimes frightening thing. And even if people never see it, they might hear about it. So something to keep in mind when it comes to writing out your campaign world. If you're adding magic, it can also shift the boundaries of your kingdoms, of your cities, and your villages and towns, because if you add magical defenses, well, now they can expand their defenses and expand their borders out further, unless they come across, an enemy nation or a neighboring kingdom that also has magical defenses and is able to push them back. So, of course, you can put restrictions on magic. Maybe it's not as abundant in this land because it's been prohibited or outlawed, or maybe magical items are, seen as unacceptable due to some event that happened there in the kingdom, some ages past. But that's something you're still going to have to keep in mind and try and keep up with. So, basics going back and forth to make sure I've got everything covered when it comes to this is when you're mapping out, make sure you've got a good continent size or island size based on it. Make sure that the settlements have a purpose and you are very clear as to how big they are, how many people are there, and so on. As always, make sure that the atmosphere of the town reflects the campaign's atmosphere. If you have a very dark and dreary campaign, there is no need for the town to be super happy and cheerful unless it's before everything goes to crap or this town is weird and something is severely wrong with it. Also remember to keep the government that is in mind, because the government over the kingdom or over the city-state will be very tight-fisted normally as to how everything's run and everything's done. Such as maybe a meritocracy, which is, the most intelligent and educated people oversee society, often with a bureaucracy to handle the day-to-day work of the government. This is kind of important because, the most intelligent and educated people overseeing society might decide, we're not going to let stupid people have magic items because there's going to be some bad times if stupid people have magic items. So we're just going to outlaw that right now. And, so that now makes it very hard to find anything. Or maybe a dictatorship where one supreme ruler holds absolute authority. That dictator might decide, okay, I want everyone who has orc in their blood or half orc, I want them out of my kingdom. I want them out. The government forms and determines what your kingdom is like and who populates it. Currency and commerce is also very important, as well as factions and languages. and of course, magic. Alright, well, that concludes today's podcast. I thank you greatly for joining me. Once again, if you are unable to hear this over Twitch because my internet is crap, then you can definitely catch a clean rebroadcast of it over on my YouTube channel at Ian Part-Time DM. Thank you very much for joining me, and I wish you guys a great and wonderful night.